Okay, I'm just updating the videos for this week with a little bit more about what's in your textbook relative to equitable distribution and to spousal support. All right, so we've talked about the difference between 50-50 splits and equitable distribution, with equitable distribution being what's fair. There are two different kinds of equitable distribution states. Pure equitable distribution and states that use marital property only in their equitable distribution. So in a pure equitable distribution state, all property, meaning that acquired before the marriage, usually not after the separation, but if you have pure equitable distribution, then that means all marital and essentially non-marital property. So this is what Indiana does. Indiana calls it a hodgepodge. And in Indiana, all of your property, when you get divorced, the stuff that you had before the marriage, the stuff that you have during the marriage, all gets put together into a hodgepodge. I'm seeing a glare here. And so all of that property is going to be distributed between the parties fairly. In a non-pure equitable distribution state, then we're going to separate out that separate property. And that separate property remains separate. So whatever you earned before the marriage, whatever you brought to the marriage, you're going to take back out with you. And it's only the stuff that you acquire as marital property during the marriage that's going to get split fairly between you. In practice, this makes very little difference, because here in a pure equitable distribution state like Indiana, for instance, it takes all of your property and then decides what's fair when they split it up. Most judges think it's fair to take your separate property with you. So it doesn't have a huge difference from the marital only states where you take your separate property with you as a matter of right, and then your marital property is distributed fairly. But it doesn't have to be that way in these pure states where they take all of your property. And so what is usually fair is the same thing. And so if you take your separate property with you and you distribute the marital property, it really doesn't make that big of a difference when push comes to shove. But that's the way that it happens. And Indiana is a pure state, and I think Kentucky is equitable. So marital only is Kentucky. So you'd have separate property, and we'll take a look at that statute as well. And you should take a look at it for your assignment. Now, as opposed to the distribution of property, let's talk for a minute about spousal support. Spousal support can be called a couple of different things. It can be called spousal support. It can be called alimony. It can be called alimony pendente lite, which means for the pendency of the litigation. So while the court case is going on, alimony or support can be given to one party to get them essentially back on their feet. Spousal support is used less often than it used to be, because it used to be that when two people divorced, the husband was the breadwinner, the wife stayed home with the kids, and the wife couldn't support herself right when the dissolution took place. So spousal support was designed to give her income so that she could go back to school, she could find a new job, the kids could grow up, and that spousal support would support her until she could support herself. And so it could go on for a while, especially decades ago when women didn't work as often and didn't make the wages that we make today. These words all can describe the exact same thing, and that is the concept of supporting your spouse for a period of time. It is used less often today. Sorry. Than it has been for those particular reasons. And a lot of people assume, and there's some case law on it in different states, that it is going to be given to someone who really needs it, meaning disabled, can't work, hasn't worked for a long time because they've raised kids, not because they just chose not to. That's typically not a good enough reason, but a disability might be. And that support is part of that obligation for you to support your spouse while you're married. Spousal support often can happen just during the pendency of the litigation. Sometimes it can happen, it can be for a particular period of time. It's a pretty good argument that if someone, let's say people are getting divorced, and let's say the wife, before she stayed home to raise children, had a teaching degree and she needs to get recredentialed, or a nursing degree, she needs to get recredentialed, or maybe at the time she got married, you only needed a bachelor's degree to teach in her field. Now you need a master's degree. It would take maybe 2 years to get a master's degree full time. Support is designed to be temporary. And the temporariness of it is because you're not this person's spouse anymore. And so it's just designed to get you from here to there. It is not designed to be permanent. And the other thing that it is not, it is typically not distribution of the estate. So someone in the last video, I talked about the fact that you can distribute property over time. So let's say you've got that $10,000 equity in the house. Somebody's keeping the house, paying the other person $5,000, but can't pay that out of the estate. So they have to pay it $500 a month for 10 months. That is not support. That is the property distribution. And if you have both in a divorce, they'll be spelled out specifically in the decree. And so the equitable distribution happens until that piece of property is distributed. Support happens until that person can support themselves. Doesn't ever have to be to the exact same standard of living as when you were married, but it does have, that person does have to be able to support themselves. So that's how support happens. Okay. Your assignment has to do with different state laws relative to property distribution. It's a question. But now you have the difference between the equitable distribution of property, pure equitable distribution, and marital distribution only, which is, if you think about it, if you remember from torts, pure and modified comparative negligence, similar to that, and in the differences between the two. And then you have support, or alimony pendente lite, which are designed to be temporary to get someone back on their feet again. And I think that is it for part 2. How all of these are calculated, how equitable distribution is calculated, and how support is calculated. Some states have support guidelines for spousal support, or the statutes might be pretty specific on when and how much is paid. Equitable distribution is much less straightforward. It is very much what's fair, and that can be based on case law. But what's fair to one party is often not fair to another party. The bottom line is if you can decide on all of this, remember, this equitable distribution and this support assumes that a judge is making a decision. Can you decide otherwise? Yes. And you can even do that relative to child support later on. So it is almost always better to come to an agreement on how to distribute your property. And as far as the courts are concerned, no one is going to care if you decide to take a bad deal or if the other person takes a bad deal, unless there's fraud or coercion or something. Any given situation, there are plenty of people who decide to walk away from their marriage with nothing, and they just want to get out, and they sign off on what have you. And that's generally speaking okay, unless someone has been defrauded or there's coercion or something along those lines. But no one is happy with equitable distribution because what seems fair to you does not seem fair to me. And it's the same way for child custody and child support. It's almost always better to keep everything out of court, but then y'all wouldn't have jobs. So that's where we are. And that's part 2.